Hi, everybody. This is Jennifer Schaus, and we are coming to you live today from downtown Washington, D.C. Today is our second in a monthly series of the GovCon Live Q&A Cafe. These are held the second Friday of each month from 12 to about 1:30 p.m., or if we finish earlier, we'll be finished earlier. We will take live questions after our presenters go through some content on the upcoming slides. All the recordings are going to be available at that same registration link that you used to get into today's event. If you're just looking for the PowerPoints, you can find them and all of our other PowerPoints from the 400 plus webinars that we've done on slideshare.net. That's a complimentary site, and I think it lets you log in with your LinkedIn credentials. So January, we already covered cybersecurity and CMMC. You can get that recording again on our website under the Q&A Cafe section. And today we're going to cover something that's pretty important and seems to be a growing trend in federal contracting, OTAs, other transaction authorities, and then you'll see the rest of the schedule here. Also on our website, again, you can register there and look for recordings after they've been completed. Okay, now just a couple moments here to thank our sponsors. First up is Crown Castle. These guys are coming to us from the Boston area. They work with both DoD and civilian agencies in the federal sector. The guy you want to talk to there is John Kipfer. He's their director of the federal sector. They're in the cell tower service, and encourage you guys to all reach out to him. Set Aside Alert is a data aggregator for small businesses, and they send out a news publication that will tell you, alert you to opportunities for small, women-owned, veteran-owned, hub zone, 8A, and all of the other set-aside businesses. It's just in a nice, easy-to-read format. Tom Johnson is your point of contact there. ZK Development has also been helping us promote the series. Jim Bender is the point of contact there. They primarily help with market analysis and proposal writing. Our friends over at the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce have their GovCon Council meetings on the third Tuesday of the month. They also have a great B2G, business to government matchmaking event, which is, I think, always the first, maybe Monday or Tuesday in May. They're going to give us the date soon, and we'll have a registration link to share with you guys. Judy Bratt has also been helping promote this series as well as our DFARS series. She provides valuable service to government contractors that are small businesses. She's written a book as well, Government Contracts Made Easier. Washington Technology has a doing business with the Air Force February 19th. The registration link is over on the left-hand corner here. We will send out the slides to everybody after today's event, so you'll have access to these links if you wanted to register or contact anybody that we've got listed here. The Virginia PTAC Procurement Technical Assistance Center is housed over at the George Mason University. They provide mentoring, matchmaking, and counseling sessions for small and emerging government contractors. A couple classes that are coming up, which were typically in the past in person, are now going to be virtual. You can attend and register. These are all complimentary by using the registration link. Again, these will be sent out, so you'll have access to these links. I believe they're also on our website under the events section, even though they're virtual. Quick piece here about us. We do provide market analysis services and other professional services for government contractors, including GSA schedule, contract compliance, and administration. Okay, so the reason we're here today, OTAs, other transaction authorities. We've got a great panel, 4 fabulous experts, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce them. I believe these are going to be alphabetical. So up first is Margaret Cassidy. She runs Cassidy Law. She's been a great colleague over the years, and she's also presented in some of our other webinars over the past several years. So Margaret, welcome, and thanks for being here. We've got Eric Crucius as well from Holland and Knight. He's a rock star over on the TV networks and has also presented in many webinars for us. So thanks, Eric, for participating again today. Jerry McGinn, good to have you back. Jerry helped us out during our COVID contracting webinar series and shed some light on some of the various tools that the government was using to purchase equipment that was needed for COVID. So Jerry, great to have you back as well. And a new face for us, but not new in the government contracting world, Lorna Teeter from MITRE. Lorna, thanks so much for joining us, and look forward to hearing your thoughts today. So, okay, OTAs, I'm going to go ahead and turn the mic over to Margaret, who's going to take us through these next couple slides.
Thanks, Jennifer. Looking forward to the conversation this afternoon. So starting, we have listed here benefits of OTAs, but maybe we should say first what they are. Other transaction authorities, and those are a methodology for the government to enter a contract outside of the acquisition process. Some of the benefits of why the government would want to go outside the acquisition process, as well as why you all as government contractors would want to go outside the government acquisition process, the normal one, the FAR, DFAR, is the speed, the flexibility, the fact that you'd be able to customize some of your agreements. We'll talk more about that a little bit when we're in the Q&A session. I said already it's outside the FAR, DFAR, so you avoid theoretically many of the requirements that are included in the federal acquisition regulations or the defense acquisition regulations. You have more, you're able to be more flexible around how you adapt and protect your intellectual property. And as a result, this is usually much easier for smaller businesses, for startup businesses, and businesses that are not used to always dealing with the United States federal government. So some of the risks, just like anything in life, the benefits also present the same risks that you face. The benefits give you a benefit, but they also give you a risk. So you're now sort of required to identify how you're going to protect your own intellectual property. You don't have the FAR or the DFAR standing there behind you defining how that's going to go down. You need to have a clear understanding of the costs of entering an OTA and negotiating it with the government, and then also the costs for how you're going to deliver the work that you ultimately perform. Same with pricing. Establishing your pricing for an OTA can be challenging as well, because it's less defined than it is if you're going to go through the acquisition regulation. Then, depending on what criteria show up in your OTA, you may have challenges meeting those criteria, because you now have a contracting officer in the United States government just putting contractual terms and conditions on a piece of paper that do not tie back to the federal acquisition regulations or do not tie back to the defense acquisition regulations. So those criteria I have seen at times are not clearly written. They're not easily understood. There's not definitions for terms. So trying to meet those criteria and understand those can be a challenge at times, depending on how it's written. Lots of times folks think that if you have an OTA and you're not subject to the federal acquisition regulations, that you are free and clear of other laws and regulations that may relate to federal government contracting. For example, conflicts of interests. You're not. You're still subject to those, because a lot of those regulations, like conflicts of interest or the False Claims Act, are not in the FAR. They're picked up by the FAR, but they're also sitting in other statutes that will apply to you. The government contract professionals are not always experienced with OTAs, and remember, you're working with them to draft something unique to your business and unique to them, and in those situations you face more risk because there's unpredictability, just like with anything with business. When there's unpredictability, then you face a little bit more risks. And then if you're joining a consortium, or if you're doing partnering with other organizations, again, it's not so clear what controls you want to put in place in those contracts to make sure that you have control of your subs or your other business partners as you perform the agreement. And then sometimes it can be a little bit challenging to mitigate those risks with your contract terms, because you don't have the familiarity to know what risks you're going to face in performance. You don't necessarily have clarity around all the clauses, because of how they're written, and they're not just repeating the FAR. And again, that saying the same thing, that unpredictability ends up causing some risks and causing businesses to find that they need to take additional steps to mitigate those risks, to understand those contract terms when they're not just dealing with the FAR. So some of the ways to manage these risks and to manage and to get the most benefit you can from the benefits of an OTA is really be definitive in the terms and conditions that are going to appear in your contract. It's like when you're entering a commercial contract, you want to be very clear in all the terms and conditions. And when a lawyer says be clear in terms and conditions, we're not only talking about the actual clause that you put in your contract, but also the definitions that you use in your contract. So without having the FAR definitions floating over your agreement with the United States government, you have to be more precise as you define different terms. If you put something in there, or you agree with the government that some costs cannot be included in your contract, you need to clearly define what those costs are. You need to be clear on your what your deliverables are. You need to be clear on the delivery schedule. You need to understand and possibly consider putting in your contract how and when you communicate with the government, how and when you do changes, and then how you're going to protect your intellectual property. What do you do if the government gives you government assets or government intellectual property? How are you expected to protect that? You need to consider and think about your work locations and the security requirements that are going to come down upon you, and plan for those. Especially if you're a new business and you don't necessarily have offices, you may be required to get an office in order to perform the OTA, depending on the type of defense information you're getting subject to. You need to think about how the contract can be terminated, what termination means, what breach means, when are you considered breaching that contract? Because again, you don't have the federal acquisition regulations that tell you when a breach may occur or help you figure that out. You need to figure out your pricing. Is it going to be fixed price, cost, time, and materials? And you should think about conflicts of interest, because you don't want to get blindsided. I see many OTAs that don't discuss conflicts of interest at all, correct? And then later, a defense contractor enters a contract with another organization, another business, and that business is subject to the FAR. That business has conflict of interest requirement language in it, and it may implicate your performance under the OTA. And oftentimes contractors do not think through that. And then you need to figure out your invoicing methods. How are you going to invoice, on what schedule, what regularity, and what descriptors are you going to have in your invoice? We can move on to the next slide, Jennifer. And I think I turn it over to one of my panelists at this point.
Boy, rookie mistake there. Did not unmute myself when I started talking. I think Margaret's points are really excellent, because they show you how different OTAs are different than regular procurement contracts in the classical sense, and all the different things you have to think about, and how you have these built-in clauses usually in a contract, and that's not there anymore when you're talking about OTAs. And that's similar in the protest sense, because OTA protests are not just like a protest that you can go and file necessarily if you're unhappy with something the government has done. It's a complicated situation, because the law, I don't think, has it fully developed yet, where in a regular procurement, if you are unhappy with a decision the agency makes in an award or in a pre-award phase, most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, you have a way to go to the agency or GAO or the Court of Federal Claims and file a protest. It's pretty standard stuff. It can be complicated from a factual perspective, and even the law can be complicated sometimes too. But there's been well worn out path out to the court to kind of vindicate those rights, and that's quite a bit different than OTAs, to the point that it's not the same ball field that we're playing on. There isn't an automatic avenue to go to a certain venue if you're unhappy with the decision that an agency is making under an OTA. And what we've seen so far in this developing area is that the courts and GAO have found that they have limited jurisdiction over OTA protests, that it's not an automatic. And for the most part, this is from a very general sense, if you're challenging an award within the OTA, if the OTA itself is legally done and properly done, you're just challenging the evaluation of an award under an OTA, you're probably not going to have a place to go to bring that protest. But there are exceptions and there are carve-outs and there's still uncertainty in this area. So I wouldn't say that all is lost for those who like the protest process, like the protest lawyers that you're looking at on the screen, some of them. You know, what I did is, and I'll show you in a few minutes, just focused on two cases as kind of case studies for us. But just looking at the slide, you know, the general sense is that if the use of the OTA vehicle is improper, for instance, it's not legally allowed, or the method of how the OTA vehicle is being used, even if it's proper, that's probably under most circumstances something that can be protested. Because you're not protesting the award decision, you're protesting the legality of the vehicle that's being used to get to that award decision. And I'm speaking in general terms because there are nuances and exceptions to all of this. And if we had 6 hours to talk about it, we could go through each one, but you would all probably log off by the time I was done. So as the slide said, and I mentioned earlier, you cannot generally protest the source selection decision. And then there's kind of nowhere to run. You see circumstances in some recent cases where the different courts are kind of pointing at each other, like, no, you need to go to the district court to vindicate this right. And district court's like, no, you have to go back to the Court of Federal Claims to vindicate this right. And some of it's just very factually specific and bad circumstance by the litigants. And some of it is that, you know, courts as a whole don't think that they have a place in deciding, you know, if an OTA decision was improperly made when it comes to the award decision. If the vehicle is proper and the method being used is proper, but there's just a disagreement with the decision itself, most, you know, courts thus far have not gotten in the way of that decision. So let's go to the next slide. So the first one was pretty interesting. This was at the Court of Federal Claims, and this came out, I'm going to look at my notes here, in August 2019, just a few months before the pandemic started, so about 10 years ago. Spacex was decided by the court. And this was a situation where there were two phases of the procurement, a phase one and a phase two. And the phase two was essentially, you know, what Spacex was challenging was the fact that they were not going to be eligible to bid in phase two. The court came back and said, under the circumstances here, this is not connected to a procurement close enough. Even if phase two was a procurement, being excluded from phase one and not being able to bid on phase two is not a close enough connection with the procurement. Because in order to kind of bring a protest in general in the Court of Federal Claims or anywhere, or in the Court of Federal Claims, let's just limit it to that for now. You know, the protest has to be in connection with a procurement. Now, the Federal Circuit, which has jurisdiction, which is above the Court of Federal Claims, has broadly defined what in connection with a procurement is. And but there has to be some nexus to procurement. And the Court of Federal Claims found that here their nexus was not melded enough, because there were two separate solicitations for phase one and phase two. You had a circumstance where the court said, just because you're excluded from phase, just because you didn't get through phase one, it means you're not going to be bidding on phase two, doesn't mean that I have jurisdiction over phase two. And the court was careful though, and said there may be circumstances where we would find jurisdiction. The court was not deciding that in this decision. So there may be wiggle room for contractors there to still bring a protest if they can get more favorable facts behind them. The court found essentially that the facts are not very favorable for the contractor here to make that argument. So that's one interesting kind of case of note there. And let's go to the next slide. And I have one more to share with you on this slide. This was really interesting. This is one where GAO found that they did have jurisdiction to essentially invalidate an OTA award. This was for cloud services. Gosh, there's been so much protest ink spilled over cloud services over the last few years. And I will not comment on the other ones. But for now, I'll focus on this, where Ring Cloud won the initial award under an OTA and then got a follow-on contract for a substantial sum in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And Oracle stepped in and said, that award was improper. And normally, under normal circumstances, GAO is not going to listen to an OTA protest. But here, they found that the law was not being properly followed, if I could speak. And the award itself did not meet all the requirements under this OTA statute. So there were two problems with this. There was a follow-on transaction that ReanCloud got worth a lot of money, and that wasn't necessarily contemplated in the beginning of the award, at the initial award phase. So in order for kind of a non-competitive award to be made in the second phase, there has to be disclosure that that's what's going to be done in the first instance, and that was not, according to GAO, done here. And then the second issue that we had was that ReanCloud had not finished the prototype project prior to the second phase award, essentially. And the statute, at least at that time, required the prototype project to be completed in order for there to be a second phase award. So under those two grounds, GAO found that the law itself, the OTA statute itself, was not being followed, at least as it was applicable to DoD. And because of that, they had jurisdiction to kind of vindicate that right. It wasn't a situation where Oracle and Reen were in a competition with each other, and GAO and the agency thought Reen's Cloud's solution was better. Did a best value evaluation, best value analysis, and found Reen to be the better contractor, and Oracle was complaining about that. They were simply complaining about the legal basis of the competition in the first place. And that's where, as a protester under an OTA, you have better luck if you want to challenge something at GAO or with the court. And I'll just note too, some litigants have tried to go to federal district court to try to vindicate their rights under an OTA. And federal district courts, at least one with MD Helicopters, found that there was, the OTA was too much intertwined with the federal procurement to be in connection with the procurement, and the Court of Federal Claims had jurisdiction over something like that. So you have a situation where you have litigants kind of looking for the right place to go if they want to try to vindicate their rights under an OTA. That the law has been far from settled yet, because we have factually different circumstances that are controlling these different cases. So the next 3 to 5 years in this area will be really interesting, or I should say between now and the next 5 years will be really interesting to see how this all plays out. We'll be watching it very closely, especially the protest lawyers on this webinar will be watching it very closely. But with that, I think I'm done with my section here, Jennifer. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm up, Jerry McGinn here. I'm going to talk about how OTAs have been used in the last few years, and then in COVID, and then what are the challenges going forward. So in short, OTs have become a big business in recent years. They were established for NASA back in the Cold War, 1958, and there was very modest use of OTs outside of NASA, Department of Energy, and DoD until kind of mid last decade. And as you can see on the chart here, the defense OT obligations grew so significantly. The obligations on the bottom line grew from less than $1 billion to $7.5 billion in the course of 5 years, and that's a 712% increase. So that is quite substantial. And overall federal obligations for OTs increased from less than $2 billion to $8 billion over the same period. So that shows you that DoD is the biggest user of OTs by far in the U.S. government, and most of the biggest users for OTs were in these efforts by Department of Defense to reach out to quote unquote non-traditional companies through vehicles such as Defense Innovation Unit in Silicon Valley, AFWorks, SoftWorks, Army Futures Command. These efforts where they're trying to find commercial technologies to bring in through rapid ways, like Margaret talked about in her slides, enables quick efforts to get things on contracts, to do prototypes. So that was all prior to COVID. So next slide. So COVID put these things on steroids. OT usage exploded during 2020. I'm talking about first how it was used in COVID, and then secondly overall. So in COVID, some of the analysis that Jennifer mentioned that we had done last year in the center, we talked about on some of her prior sessions. The federal government, basically threw the kitchen sink at COVID. and ended up obligating over $40 billion through September of last year for federal COVID spending. And that was in lots of different ways, quick turn RFQs and the like. But of that, $9 billion was spent on OTs, and that was most of that went towards vaccine development, Operation Warp Speed, but also it was also used in other ways as well. Another thing that happened during COVID is that the CARES Act was passed in very late March, raised the thresholds for both Department of Defense and as well as expanded the authority for HHS, which really hadn't done a lot of OT usage prior to this. So this allowed some of the larger scale COVID response efforts, such as vaccine development or other industrial capability development. So yeah, so that's with the story in COVID. Now overall, the U.S. federal OT obligations totaled almost $18 billion. So, but if you take out the COVID of $9 billion, you still get quite a bit of half of that, another $9 billion in almost in OT obligations. Overall, DoD accounted for $16.3 billion, or 90% of the total federal obligations. The DoD ones, you can see that the math doesn't exactly line up, but that's because a good amount of the DoD money went to COVID through medical contracts, through Defense Health Agencies, and Defense Health Agency, and other areas. So, but you can see in one fiscal year, the total OT obligations doubled from $8 billion in 2019 to nearly $18 billion in 2020. But if you just take out COVID, even if you take out COVID, you'll see that the overall obligations grew from 8 to 9 billion. So significantly healthy growth of OTs. So next. So the great news about OTs is that they're growing fast, but there are two major challenges. First was some of the points that Margaret alluded to in her slides. OTs are outside of traditional acquisition challenges. They're not governed by the FAR. They're not part of the respective agency, the DFAR, or other kind of respective health agency acquisition systems, which is good in some ways, but also creates challenges. OTs are made for prototypes. They're not in the DoD parlance. They don't directly lead to programs of record, which allows you to develop new ideas. But then where do they go? OTs often struggle with transition. It's a sort of different kind of valley of death where you build great things, but at the end of the day, at least mostly in the Department of Defense, you've got to find a program that within the military departments that then wants to transition this thing to actually field it. And so that's much harder to do. And that's been sort of a perennial struggle with OTs. And they increase the use of them, and through places like DIU and AFWERX and the Army Research Command is exacerbated this issue in a sense. So that's just by nature of OTs. So they're sexy, they're easy to get on contract, but what's the long-term play? And the second major challenge with OTs is that what Congress giveth, Congress can taketh away. And here is, they've done tremendous amounts in the last 5-6 years to encourage the more use of OTs across the U.S. government, and the CARES Act really kind of helped do that even more. However, we're just one fraud, waste, and abuse case away from a changing of opinions on Capitol Hill. You could have a major kind of as Eric talked about, there have been cases where agencies, don't necessarily appropriately use the OT authority. They use, and that's had impacts on protests. But really, if there's abuse, or in the sense of using it for not its intended purposes, that can lead to Congress saying, no, this is not, we're doing too much of this. And they could ratchet that back. So those are the two things going forward. I expect to see kind of OT spending not be what it was in 2020 this year, because the COVID need for OTs in COVID is probably much less. But those are the two major challenges going forward. So back to you, Jennifer.
Okay, so I am not a lawyer. I was with the Air Force for 31 years as a contracting officer, and I awarded my very first OT for research in 1997. And a year later, I awarded my first OT for prototype. So you know what that means? It means I've got war stories. Other transactions have been gaining popularity over the last few years. So because they're becoming more known now, a lot of people who are just hearing about them for the first time think that they are some kind of newfangled, barely legal tool for getting around the FAR. There are really, they don't know how long they've been around, but there are really, there are some other new things that have happened in recent years about the same time that OTs have been gaining popularity. And so that means that those get mixed up at times. So one of the misconceptions is the whole idea of OTAs equal MTA as a middle tier of acquisition. So recently, very recently, the new policies that have taken the place of the old DoD 5000 have rolled out. DoD 5000, those were the rules that we had to follow for like major weapons programs. Very convoluted. You'd have to go to like a 3-week course just to figure out how to navigate that with the program that you're working on. So all these rules, those rules have now been replaced by the Adaptive Acquisition Framework, the AAF, which has, instead of one huge way of doing like hardware intensive programs, now it's 6 different pathways. So if you're trying to do something that's urgent and you need this done urgently and finished in the next 2 years, then you'd follow the urgent capabilities pathway. If you're doing software, you might follow the software pathway. If you're doing the old hardware intensive program, then you'd follow the major capability acquisition pathway. The new one that that people have been struggling with over the last couple of years is called middle tier of acquisition. So you want to do your rapid prototyping within 5 years and do rapid fielding after that within 5 years. And by the way, you can mix and match these different pathways. You can jump from one to another, tailor it, customize however you need to for your program. So with middle tier of acquisition, because you're doing rapid prototyping, that's ideal for OTs for prototype. And then when you start to do rapid fielding, that's ideal for OTs for production. So the confusion is the MTA is an acquisition pathway that comes with its own policy. It's there are documents and approvals that you need to go this route. Now the contract that you award as part of the MTA, say for rapid prototyping, could be a contract or it could be an OT, but the terms are not interchangeable. If you are using an OT, or if the government is using an OT, that doesn't mean that they can ignore the AAF pathway or what its requirements are. And this is always a good tip for if you're jumping from one pathway to another, or let's say you're doing an OT for prototype and you don't go to an OT for production, but instead switch over to a FAR-based contract for production, then you want to make sure that somewhere in there, so that you don't have any downtime, that you take care of all the paperwork before you get to an OT, before you get to a FAR-based contract, because the FAR-based contract might require more documentation, more approvals than an OT for production would. So the contracting officer and the program office team have to keep that in mind so that they don't have a gap in schedule. So just another misconception there. There is a myth that competition is not required. The government really should get as much competition as possible, but it's still kind of a judgment call based on urgency, based on what in particular are you buying? Have you done your market research to find out that there's really nobody else out there who stands a snowball's chance of doing this? I was never one to drag vendors through a competition process just for competition's sake. When the rain cloud protest decision came out, that if you're going to do a follow-on sole source production OT, then you have to have already competed an OT for prototype and announced that up front. Different attorneys I talked to at the time said, yeah, okay, so if you do it that way through competition of OT for prototype, then you can go sole source to OT for production. Or you would have to do some type of sole source documentation while you're going sole source without competition, maybe similar to what they do for a FAR-based production sole source contract, like they call it a J&A, a justification and approval sole source document that it can be quite lengthy, and it goes up through the chain of command and they sign off on it. So far, from everybody I've talked to, nobody's been willing to do a sole source documentation. They would rather go through the competition. If I were a contracting officer or agreements officer, as it's called for OTs, in the field right now, I would not be opposed to going sole source and doing that kind of documentation if I felt in my heart of hearts that there's no way anybody but this one vendor can do that job. And I would be okay with writing up that kind of documentation, because I like to write, I like to make my case. But if I felt, and if my market research turned up that, yeah, there are other vendors out there who could do this, then I would definitely be looking at competing that. There's another myth that OT awards are faster than traditional FAR contracts. That can definitely be true. There's a government team that I worked with recently that looked at their acquisition strategy and realized that if they did an OT through a consortium, then they were going to be able to cut off an entire year of their procurement lead time. That is major. I mean, that's not just getting to the technology a year quicker or getting to delivery a year quicker, but it's also that you're not spending a year's worth of government resources or vendors' resources to get there. Now, OTs can also not be faster. When you're most likely to see that is if you have an agreements officer who wants to recreate the FAR. That's what they're familiar with. That's what they're comfortable with. They've maybe never seen an OT before. Maybe they're looking at a template, and they're just not comfortable with something that's not already all this FAR boilerplate. You know, one time somebody told me that the FAR has all these clauses, like 72,000 clauses, because 72,000 people messed up somewhere along the way. So you got to have a clause for everything. But they're familiar with FAR clauses and all the supplement clauses, and that's what they try to put into the OT. They may be told, don't rewrite the FAR. Don't use a clause word for word. So then they'll get out their thesaurus and try to come up with different synonyms, or maybe put a different header over verbatim FAR language, FAR clauses, and put that in the OT. The purpose is not to find another synonym for a FAR term. It's to find a different mindset, a better mindset. Another myth, that OT agreements lead to more successful outcomes than you get in a FAR contract, or the reverse of that, which is actually what I hear more often, is that OTs will lead to worse outcomes. This is what I hear from within the government, from people who are kind of afraid to use OTs. I was actually in an OT roadshow a couple of years ago, and I was sitting in the back of the room, and most everybody knew that I had done a lot of OTs throughout my career. And a newer contracting officer was sitting a couple of seats ahead of me. He had never done an OT, didn't particularly like them. You might even say he hated them. And the speaker says, "So does anybody have any questions about OTs?" And he raised his hand. I'm like, okay, what can he possibly ask? His question was, "So where's the repository for OTs gone bad?" And I'm sitting in the back of the room kind of laughing about this and saying, smart mouth, saying things under my breath like, yeah, that repository is right next door to the repository for FAR contracts gone bad. We're talking about a business arrangement here. So you're probably not going to have a lot of difference in the technical outcome, whether it's an OT or it's a FAR contract. The biggest differences I can point to, and from personal experience, if the technology doesn't make it across the valley of death, or there's something that goes wrong on the technical side of the program, and let's say you get to failure, at least you have, if you've through an OT been able to save money, or the contractor can save money and pass that money on, that savings to the government, then you may fail. The program office may fail, but it fails quicker and for fewer dollars. So I think you're most likely going to get to the same technical outcome. It's just a different business arrangement to get there. The fact that you're doing an OT is probably not going to be the reason that a technology doesn't work out. And one other thing that we haven't mentioned here yet, there's a misconception that other transactions are only for consortia. These are some of the things that you're seeing a lot of in the last couple of years, and the more you see them, the more it reinforces that that's the only way it can be done. OTs can actually be awarded in two ways. One is that they can be direct OTs, as they're known. They're awarded directly to the individual vendor. That's the only way I ever awarded OTs throughout my entire career. I only worked with consortia in the last few years. But it's awarded just like you would award a contract. So a contracting officer might put out a request for proposal or a broad agency announcement, and they will say in there, the government intends to award a FAR-based contract or a FAR contract, or maybe they'll just say a firm fixed price contract because they really don't differentiate that much. The government plans to award a FAR contract, a grant, because they need to let industry know what type of contracting vehicles they might use. And if you're academia, then you'd want to probably get a grant, or an other transaction for prototype. So that's already, it's put in the solicitation so that industry knows what the government is thinking in terms of contract awards. And that's how they would put it out there. And then, well, upon selection, when you get through source selection, it would be negotiated as an OT instead of a FAR contract or a grant. The other way of awarding OTs is awarding them to a consortium. And the consortium will kind of act as a, I'll paraphrase here a little bit. They'll kind of act as a pseudo government program office with their own consortium manager, their own contract person, kind of reflecting the government program office. And they will work with their members on the requirements that come down. I'm becoming a big fan of consortia just in the last few months, because I see them doing some hand-holding with non-traditional defense contractors or startups or small businesses, people who just really aren't familiar with working with the government, with DoD contracting. So they're kind of filling in the gap a little bit there, and helping to give some guidance that isn't normally available. But if if you're a vendor and you want to join a consortia, do your homework. Make sure that you are aligned with their purpose. Don't go collecting consortia. Look at maybe 2 or 3 that are most aligned with your technology or whatever your purpose is. Maybe if your purpose is to support special ops, if your technology is 5G, line up with the one that is most appropriate to your business goals. And you also want to look at them to make sure they're not relying solely on maybe exorbitant membership fees to exist. Don't ask yourself a year later, hey, is this a $500 membership fee, or in some cases I've heard of $2,000, $5,000, $10,000 a year membership fees. Is this worthwhile? If you're asking if it's worthwhile, then maybe you're not aligned with the right consortium, or maybe it's not the right consortium for you. So just do your homework on that. And kind of check them out. They're not really regulated like you think they would be. There's no one way that these consortia are set up. So just be aware, check them out, do your due diligence before you join up. And I will pass back to Jennifer now.
Sorry, I think I was muted. Thanks everybody for a great presentation. Now we're going to go through some questions, and if anybody in the audience has any questions, there is a control panel. It should be on your right-hand side with a couple options. Then towards the bottom, there should be a little window that opens that says questions. Just type those in. They're all anonymous, so no stupid questions and no bad questions can be asked. We're happy to answer anything. So I'm going to run through a couple that we've got that the speakers kind of gave us in advance just to get you guys thinking. And Margaret, the first one's going to go to you, so I'll make sure you guys have your microphones back on. What are the benefits of an OTA for a contractor? And Margaret, this is over to you. Let's see here. We'll unmute you. Or it looks like you're self-muted. If you can turn your mic back on. Yeah, we're not able to hear you, Margaret. See here.
Okay.
Oh. Try again. Sorry.
She was unmuted for a brief second there.
Okay, try now.
All right, I should be unmuted.
Sorry.
Right. So I think the benefits a lot of us have been talking about already, and I think framing a little bit off of what Lorna said is that one of the benefits I think is what an OTA is not, right? It is not, as we discussed, a procurement contract. It is not a grant. It is not a cooperative agreement. So it's not subject to the FAR, the DFAR, or the uniform guidance. It still is a legally binding agreement or contract. So the benefit that I think is something a contractor will receive is that it allows you to sit at the table with the government and negotiate more freely because you're not beholden to the FAR, the DFAR, or grant or cooperative agreements regulatory requirements. And when you are able to more freely negotiate, theoretically, you should be able to get closer to what you would have if you were in a commercial contract without all of the requirements of the FAR or the DFAR. And I think that's one of the biggest benefits. It does, though, still require both the contractor and the government to comply with certain laws and regulations. It's not a free-for-all. It's sort of what Jerry said about Congress. It's even before that, whatever hit Congress, the problem is going to hit with the Office of Inspector General, with other investigative agencies if they believe something is not going correctly in the contracting process, whether that be a procurement contract process or an OTA contract. But I think one of the biggest benefits, like I said, is the fact that it does allow for that kind of speed. I think another benefit that it allows for is that, you know, you're supposed to, at the DoD, be using an OTA generally for research and development type contracts when DoD determines it's practical to do so, when the research under the OTA is not duplicating any other ongoing contract. Similarly, when you move into a prototype type OTA, then it's also beneficial to the contractor because it allows you to give some opportunity to yourself and working with the government to do to see the feasibility of a technology or a process, concept, or system that allows you to then keep moving forward in some concepts that you have that you're looking to develop, and you can work with the government to get some funding around that. That's another benefit, and it allows you as a contractor to more easily contract with the government because you're not beholden to the procurement process or the contracting rules and regulations that exist. It allows you to have the flexibility that you have closer to the commercial marketplace. That's one of the sort of policy reasons that DoD at least has in place the need for OTAs, is the fact that they theorize that it allows them to be more competitive in the commercial space. It allows them to be more out front in getting opportunities with emerging technology and emerging capabilities, emerging softwares, or other emerging capabilities or innovations that it may be harder for the government to grab when you tell an innovative, non-traditional defense contractor, well, you know, here's the FAR. Make sure that you comply with all these regulations and make sure you set your whole business up to comply with the FAR. A really innovative, nimble business is not going to be keen on using that, and they are going to be more inclined to stay in the commercial marketplace. With the release of having to follow the FAR or the DFAR, you now get the flexibility of the commercial space. You get a more customized agreement between you and the United States government. You're able to adapt your IP provisions, and it allows you, I know Lorna said that there's not necessarily more speed, but oftentimes there is more speed in the use of an OTA when you're not having to, the government's not having to manage the procurement process. So I think those are some of the benefits, and I'd love to hear what my fellow panelists think about the benefits as well.
If anybody wants to chime in.
I think those are great points, Margaret. I think just the whole idea that you start with a clean sheet. So if you know, if the business kind of world dictates that a certain IP clause should be a certain way, the government has the flexibility to do that without violating the FAR. And you kind of lead into what I'm talking about. You talked about it being faster, and without a protest process there, sometimes it is faster when contractors can't kind of drag out, for lack of a better term, I would never say it's dragging out, but drag out a procurement because there are multiple protests on a procurement. I've been through too many of them, where a client has won an award and we're 3 protests in the GAO and it's been a year and a half, or something like that after corrective actions and things like that. And that's less likely to happen here because of the OTAs. So I think great points though.
Great. Okay, we'll move on to the next question, and we'll stick with you, Eric, here. What should contractors do if they don't win an OTA?
Yeah, so they should see if they could protest. I mean, the thing that, there's a couple of ways to kind of look at it if you don't win the competition that you're in. I mean, almost all the time, the government's acting in good faith, just 99% of the time plus, and they just have a difference of opinion about who should win the award. And perhaps that's, somewhat the fault of the contractor sometimes, where not everything gets in the proposal that should get into the proposal because the contractor assumes the government knows certain things, or, that happens with the incumbents a lot where, the government knows that we're doing X, Y, and Z, so we don't have to put that in the proposal when in fact you do. And sometimes that's the fault of the government. Sometimes they just make mistakes. Where government is made up of humans and humans make mistakes. But with an OT, so at the end of a procurement process, a traditional procurement process, if you don't win the award, you want to kind of look inside and evaluate and do it quickly because there are time limits. But look inside and evaluate, was this award not to us because of something we did, or do we really think that, there was an error in how it was evaluated? And we find that getting more information to the contractor usually helps prevent protests, because a lot of times a protest is just a search for information. And that lack of information that makes a contractor think the government's hiding something, and sometimes they've spent upwards of 6 figures, preparing a proposal and putting it in, and they just simply want an explanation. It's a little bit different for OTAs, because you don't necessarily have a protest right for OTAs. So you want to go through all those kind of thought processes that we just talked about with a traditional contract, but also, what are my options here? And that's going to be more of a complicated question. But you want to, if there is a thought that the OTA was not properly procured, or the award decision was somehow not in line with what the components of the award were supposed to be, or was not evaluated properly, that's something that a contractor should look at, and look at whether there is a potential protest right there if that's something they want to pursue. Sometimes the best protests are the ones that are not filed, and there may be ones that there may be something there, but for business reasons it shouldn't be filed. But there also may be something there that should be filed, and it will take time for your government contracts lawyer to kind of distill it and see, all right, is there a venue that we can go to file this protest that won't be dismissible? The answer is probably no, at least for certain, but there are options that are still out there because this area of law is somewhat unsettled. So what I'd say for contractors who have not won an OTA that they've been going for is to kind of do that introspection, see why they didn't win. And then if they think that the lack of, the non-win was because of something that, the government did wrong, then, contact your friendly local government contracts lawyer and see if you have options moving forward.
Great. Okay, and Jerry, over to you for this. Will OT spending, COVID and non-COVID, increase in fiscal year 2021?
Yeah, I hinted at this in my remarks. I think OT spending will decrease from the incredible numbers of 2020, but that's largely because the COVID spend for OTs is gonna drop, and that's natural because now we're moving into production. We're building facilities for PPE production. We're doing our vaccine production. So that's so it's less appropriate for OT. So I would expect them to drop. The non-COVID, I would expect to see that continue to tick up because even in COVID world, we see tremendous amounts of actions from particularly OT consortiums, such as Luna alluded to, that are just getting more and more robust. Not less so. So I would expect total will be down as a federal government, but I think non-COVID is likely to be tick up.
Great. Okay. And Lorna, do you think bad press about other transactions will result in restrictions on their use?
Well, like Jerry said earlier, we may be one fraud, waste, and abuse away from Congress taking all of this away from us. But there is a positive spin on this. I think the negative stories, the protests, and so forth as well, will create boundaries or structure around the unknowns that we have with OTs. Take the rain cloud protests, for example. When that happened, there was a lot of groaning and gnashing of teeth from those of us who have been pushing, yeah, let's go do OTs. These are great, because we were afraid of what would happen. But what came out of it instead was a structure that we are all embracing now, and that is that, okay, if you compete the OT for prototype, then you can do a sole source follow-on to the OT for production. Nobody really knew that or were following those guidelines before that protest. So protests aren't necessarily a bad thing, looking at it from the government side. Another example, early OT that I did, and I found out about this literally decades after the fact. We got a kind of a bad review on it years later. It was nothing that caused anything to stop. It was all done competitively. All of that was above board. But the review criticized a particular choice of words that we used at the time. And we were following DARPA precedents. Legal counsel loved it. Policy chief loved it. Everybody was on board with everything we were doing. Just tremendous, good, positive support. And one of the things that this review of the OT and how we used it said was that we should have followed this particular guidance. I was like, I've never heard of that guidance. So I went back and I really had to dig to find it. I found the guidance, and it was actually published 2 years after we awarded that OT. And the guidance was based on different wording and using specific types of words at the time and what those were interpreted to mean. So the guidance was out there, but it didn't exist while we were writing the document. So the more we learn, the more we gather data, it all begins to shape the future of an acquisition tool. And you know, sometimes you don't know as a contracting officer what will fly until you actually do it. Around 2 years ago, I was working with a program office who wanted to do something with their OT that had never been done before. And I mean, they were really breaking new ground, but they decided, you know, we don't want to get in trouble for this. We want to make sure that if trouble comes later, that we've got policy and legal behind us. So they sent it to their policy office and their legal office to get a read, as they called it. And policy thought it was okay. Legal counsel refused to give them a read. They said, yeah, go ahead and do it, and if you get questioned or get in trouble for it, we'll write an opinion for you then. It may not support what you're doing, but we're going to wait until after you've actually done this before we give you our opinion. Okay, so if you were a contracting officer in that contracting officer's shoes, would you go ahead and do something new and different when legal has just told you, we don't know if we can support you on this or not, we'll tell you later? So a lot of times the way I like to use guinea pig as a verb, as an action verb. You know, let's go guinea pig this thing. Let's be the first to do it. And a lot of contracting officers out there are not willing to. They don't have the support system to do that. They don't have maybe the credibility or the reputation to go do something that's really that new and unusual. So when somebody does do something that's a little bit different and maybe it's a little bit edgy and they get questioned over it later, that questioning at that point will help to shape the structure that is put on that tool. The contracting officers can't be afraid of a retroactive opinion or being misjudged later. They've got to take action. That's more the problem than them taking action is that they seem to be very conservative, very afraid to take action. So encourage it where we can, and if they get a protest or if they get questioned later, then that helps to set up the rules that we'll all live by in the future.
Great. Okay, and Margaret, what are the risks of an OTA for a contractor?
So I think Lorna just kind of discussed one of the risks that's out there is that your government contracting officer may be a little bit reluctant to even consider using an OTA. I can tell you this, and it's probably, I don't even know Eric, but I could probably speak to him on this. If one of my clients comes to me and asks me guidance on something, I'm never saying ever, I would be the world's worst lawyer if I said, I'm not going to answer you. You're going to have to go figure that out yourself. I'm sure Eric has the same exact feeling. So shame on those government lawyers for taking a pass on that. That's kind of what a lawyer is supposed to do, is to say, hey, this is how you manage the law, and this is how you can make sure that you do it in a way that is reasonable, even when we don't know what the law is, or even when there's no real law out there for us to follow, which, believe it or not, that still happens a lot of the time. Our clients come to us with problems and ask us a question, and they think that we have some big law book that we can go look at, and lots of times there is no answer. And in those situations, we do the best that we can. We tell our clients the risk, and this goes to OTAs. We tell our clients the risk, like, I'm not really sure because there's really no legal guidance for us on this, but here is what the world of possibilities that could happen if you do it this way, and here's what's possible if you do it that way. I can't know, but at least we can give you some guardrails and some analysis of the risks. So just saying that about lawyers, it's a good thing about us. We usually give you our thoughts and opinions on what may or may not happen.
We have to bill our time somehow. Sorry.
What was that, Eric?
I said we have to bill time somehow.
Right. Well, but I mean, it's not even billing time. It's like,
Yeah.
I can't imagine one of my clients coming to me and saying, Margaret, I got a problem. I can't solve this. I got a legal problem. I can't solve this. I don't know what to do. And me saying, hey, take a swing at it. Do whatever you want. And if you get in trouble or if something goes foul, then get in touch with me. I'd be like, what? I feel like an idiot.
I wouldn't have clients for very long, that's for sure.
Right. Who would keep coming to us, right? They'd be like, she's strange. She won't give me answers. Anywho, back to the risks of an OTA. I think one of the risks are that your government contracting officers, as Lauren had just explained, sometimes don't want to commit to using an OTA, or when they write it, as Lorna said, they're trying to paraphrase the FAR, or they're trying to include FAR-like clauses in there. And then you're stuck with a FAR mishmash, is what I call it. It's like some sort of FAR clause that has now been distorted into some sort of other language. Alternatively, you may have terms and conditions that are really important to you as a contractor not included in your contract. You may not have direction from the contracting officer about what they want, how you're supposed to interface with them. One of my clients right now is struggling with trying to get data and information from the government under their OTA, and it's not clearly defined in the OTA how the government is supposed to be exchanging information with my client. So my client is now stuck trying to, outside of the OTA, have discussions with the government to get the government to give them the information they need to execute. There's things you can do. You can amend the OTA, you can make modifications and changes to it to try to get what you need to have accomplished, but that is a risk, which falls into another risk. Changing, modifying, amending an OTA, that also can be challenging, because sometimes if your contracting officer writes the OTA and doesn't include a change or modification clause in there, then when the moment comes where you want to change or modify the OTA, there's no direction in the OTA of how to change or modify the OTA. There's just some basic contractual requirements that I have seen missing in OTAs: change clauses, modification clauses, how do you exchange data, how is data protected? If you give something, your data or your intellectual property, to the government, what sort of controls is the government going to put around protecting your data and your information and your intellectual property? Who's the key personnel that has to perform? There's situations where the OTA doesn't identify who key persons are. You move somebody off of performing that OTA, then all of a sudden the government's crying foul saying that was a key person, but the OTA doesn't say they were a key person. So the challenge around an OTA, like I started this, are the same. The challenges under your OTA contracting methodologies are the same as your risks. The flexibility, the lack of the use of the FAR, those create situations where there's lack of definition. And I think all business folks know that certainty reduces risk. And when you have uncertainty, your risk increases. So, but when you increase your risk, often your rewards are increased as well. That's not always the case with the OTA. You want to make sure that if you are going to get greater rewards through working through an OTA because of increased risks, that your financial remuneration will be higher as well. And I think the other risk, not really of the OTA, but is for entities that seek to enter an OTA. If you're a non-traditional defense contractor or a non-traditional government contractor and have never walked in the shoes of being a federal government contractor or been subject to a FAR or a DFAR contract, and you think, oh, I can get an OTA and I don't have to worry about all of those regulations that everybody talks about, that's a little bit of a misconception, because oftentimes those FAR regulations actually are included in statutes elsewhere that you're still going to have to follow. So thinking to yourself, if I sign up for an OTA, I don't have to follow all of those government requirements and what it's like to work with the government when you have a FAR contract, is kind of a misunderstanding, because there's so many requirements. I hit on conflicts of interest that are still going to come down, and you're going to be obligated to follow as a result of other statutes, other laws, or other regulations that exist for you. So I'm going to turn it back over to my fellow panelists and have them discuss what they think some of the risks may be, and other topics as well.
Anybody care to chime in?
I think Margaret kind of hit it on the head. So just kind of repeating what she said, that you just don't have a set of FAR clauses out there. So just because you're starting from scratch, there are risks of just kind of not knowing what you're getting yourself into. And from every kind of FAR clause that, or DFARS or other agency clause that we've bemoaned over the years, the clauses go both ways. They sometimes help the contractors too. So when they're not there, you have to account for those risks. Like Margaret said, that there still are risks involved, and there still are statutes that are applicable to OTAs that, even if it's not in your contract, you still have to abide by it. So this question, kind of, I stepped onto this question when I did my initial presentation about circumstances when an OTA can be protested. It's really just the circumstances where mainly the circumstances where, I should say, there is a theory that the government's not following the statute or regulations on how an OTA is supposed to be procured or kind of competed or decided. And that's where you have the clearest shot at protesting an OTA. It's less clear that you can protest an OTA when there is a competition decision that you don't like. But I'm not willing to give up on the fact that can't be protested under any circumstances. I think there are opportunities potentially to do that down the road. So that's my short answer to that question.
Okay, great. We'll move on here. Jerry, how will agencies improve transition prospects for OTAs in the future?
That's the $100 million question in my view. I think I'm hopeful that they'll sort of recognize what they're using OTs to do now, and try to help adapt the overall system so that you can do what you're doing with OTs as part of acquisition. So middle tier, I mean, to especially disagree with Lorna a little bit. Well, I'm not disagreeing with you, but your point about OTAs do not equal middle tier, I agree with. But what I'd like to see is more middle tier, more kind of developing of prototypes for major systems, so that you can eventually down select to one or more systems, so you get more industrial-based activity, keeping more competitors there, and the industrial base overall warm. So I expect to see more of this in the future, because there's actually been one procurement OTA that I think DIU has tried to use. So I think there's going to be, this is kind of the next frontier on, I think beyond OTAs is, I guess, a way to think about it.
Great, thank you for that. And Lorna, what improvement would you like to see in OTAs?
I would love to see OTA authority expanded to other cool statutory authorities. The current understanding of a production OT is that you can only get to a production OT if you've already done a prototype OT. I want to see that expanded to other statutory authorities like 10 U.S.C. 2373, maybe price challenges. But my favorite is 10 U.S.C. 2373, procurement for experimental purposes. Previous name for that was acquisition for experimental or test purposes. Somewhere along the way, it got changed from acquisition to procurement. So now you have a lot of people who think procurement, oh, okay, that means not the buying of something, but production, because procurement equals production in terms of money. So that's kind of confusing. This particular statute allows the DoD to test or experiment with different supplies and get their designs in 9 different tech categories. And the most recent one added was telecommunications. So that covers so much today in terms of game-changing technology. But they can they can have essentially like a bake-off, so to speak, under 2373, testing different supplies, different methods of, let's see, like I did one, my very first one was to test a bomb casing. Is it as strong if it's welded together as it is if it's all forged? So you could test or experiment with different solutions and then potentially go straight into an OT for production. The attorneys I've talked to have said that, well, it's kind of vague enough after the rain cloud protest decision. It's vague enough that you could try going from a 2373 direct to an OT for production. But most tell me that it's that they read it as the OT for prototype is the only way to get there. So I'd really like to see that authority open up to other ways of going to an OT for production. If it's competed, fine, don't care. I just want it to be out there and available as another tool that we can use to get across the valley of death. And opening up this authority even more is something that I'm pushing for because I think that it could be a very big gain for all of us.
Great. And okay, so if anybody has questions, please feel free to type them in on the right-hand side. And it looks like we do have some here, so I'm going to read them in the order that they were received. And just a quick reminder that today's session is being recorded. All of the PowerPoints that we've done from every webinar, which is about 400 to 450 webinars, are all on SlideShare. So it's slideshare.net. That's where you can get the PowerPoints. We will also email them to you. And then all of our webinars are on YouTube. So let's dig into the actual questions. What is the best way to employ OTAs outside of a consortium setting? And anybody wants to take that, feel free to jump in.
Okay, so to me, it sounds like we're talking about direct OTs as opposed to a consortium OT. And that's just simply you can use your solicitation as you would for a FAR contract or a grant or any other way that you as a contracting officer would try to get to industry. But when you get to the negotiation part of it, that's when you're going to negotiate it as an OT instead of a FAR contract. And it's very simple to do that.
Great. And this may be a similar question. Where do you find OTAs other than consortium? How do you begin the process?
I'll just add.
Yeah,
go ahead, Mark. Sorry.
Yeah.
No, please.
Go on. That's all right.
Oh. There are a lot of different ways that it could start. It could start with the government seeking information from the contracting or non-contracting community, I should say. There are specific programs like DIU-X, now known as DIU, that are always looking for new ideas, and they have their own processes. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. You can approach the government under certain circumstances with a new technology and convince the government to use an OT as a vehicle. So there's a lot of different ways that that process can get started along the way.
Great. Okay, and the next question is it helpful to go through a lobbyist to achieve success in your application for an OTA since the review process is not the same as competitive acquisition?
Yeah, I don't know if you need a lobbyist, but you may, it's always useful to have a guide, someone that's, if you've never responded to an OT before, if you're not a member of the consortium, or if it's a direct OT, you may want to get some help from there are lots of groups that can help you kind of understand those tools better outside if you want to hire them, or you can just do the research yourself.
And I think Jerry's great point. I would just add also is that not every agency has OT authority and has OT authority for everything. So, trying to understand that, as kind of Jerry said, is important too, because there may be circumstances where you have something that would fit perfectly in an OTA, but the agency just can't do it. So understanding that in advance is really good too. The thing that frustrates me a little bit about OTAs as they are right now is it's very stovepipe, where it's agency to agency has different requirements or different guides, and there's different statutes about each agency, different grants with each agency. You know, that when the FAR came into place, the idea was to smooth out the differences between agencies, which has largely happened, but now we have different agency level clauses. The DFARS is as big as the FAR. And you know, I wish that the OTs were a little bit more uniform around the government to make it easier for contracting businesses, non-traditional contractors, to come in and understand it.
And I think Eric makes a great point on the agencies, and just a quick reminder for everyone, the agencies that do have the authority: Department of Defense, as we've been talking about, Energy has the authority, Department of Energy, Homeland Security has the authority, Transportation does, Health and Human Services, as I believe Jerry mentioned, and then NASA have the authority. So it's important to remember that when you develop your acquisition strategy, does the agency you want to engage with actually have the authority to even use an OTA? And then Eric made a great point. The second question you have to ask yourself is, are the products or the services, the technology that I'm peddling to the government, is it covered? Does the agency that allows for OTAs, does that agency have regulations, guidance around around my product or my goods that I'm selling, or my services or my technology that I'm selling to the government? Because unless the particular agency doesn't have the authority to buy something from you through an OTA, it doesn't work. I had a client that I worked with who change management, professional services, strategy planning, strategy consulting. That was generally his company's business, and he was trying to get an OTA with that through the Department of Defense. Well, that doesn't really fit the Department of the Defense requirements for when they are allowed to purchase with an OTA. So I think Eric and Jerry made two great points. A, you got to figure out what the agency it is, and then B, is that agency going to use, can they use an OTA to buy what you're trying to sell? And then once you kind of answer those questions, then figure out what your acquisition strategy is, how you build those relationships, how you get that information to the agency to consider what you're trying to sell.
Okay, I'm going to take it down to a little bit lower level than that, Margaret. It's not just whether the agency has the authority to do an OT, but the actual offices. I mean, DoD has authority, Air Force has authority, but a particular buying office may not have OT authority, or they may have only OT for prototype authority, but not OT for research authority. So it does get, it's not consistent at all, even insofar as what are the requirements for a contracting officer to be an agreements officer, so that they have a contracting officer's warrant specifically to write OTs, and that's different. I know the Navy is doing a pilot program now that would allow program managers to be agreements officers for lower level kind of consistent type OTs, whereas Air Force has much more stringent requirements where you have to be an unlimited warrant contracting officer in order to be an agreements officer. So there's no consistency anywhere out there.
Okay, and we've got about 7 minutes left and a couple questions still coming in, so we'll try to buzz through these as quickly as possible. Can you please address whether the Buy America Act applies to OTAs, and what support is there for this assertion? Thank you.
That's a great question. I may defer it to Eric on this, but and maybe Margaret, but I don't think it would apply. But yeah, that is a good question.
Usually things like that apply if they're in your contract, right? I think the government in most circumstances would have to write those into the OTA agreement. But Margaret may have a different take.
No, I think that's right. I think, well, and first off, again, it's going to depend on what agency, right? If you're at the Department of Transportation, they have very specific by domestic preference domestic preferences at the agency, which may, by virtue of how those regulations are drafted, have to be in all purchases that the Department of Transportation makes. Whereas your other agencies like Department of Defense, Buy America comes into the contracts through the FAR, as Eric just said. With that said, I would caution selling non-US product or product made, particularly product or technology or software development from countries, particularly that are not friendly to the United States of America, because you're going to have other challenges. And as I said, other laws and regulations often apply to a contractor's behavior outside of the federal acquisition regulations. So if you're going to be developing something that is arguably going to be export controlled some way or another, or that is critical technology that the US government believes that it has to protect for national interest, and you decide to outsource that to Pakistan or someplace else like that, you're going to potentially run up afoul of other laws and regulations. And then in my experience, I mean, that the times where I have seen clients working with an OTA where they are developing something that is most likely going to be export controlled, critical technology or something of that nature, the OTA contracting officer has put in essentially a Buy America clause. It's not the FAR Buy America clause, but it is the prohibition saying that you're going to comply with the export regulations, that you're going to keep this insourced in the United States of America, etc. So short answer, I think that it does not technically apply from a very legal technical perspective, but I think it's going to be read in there in a number of different ways. And if you are in fact discussing with the United States government about an OTA and you have any inkling that you're going to go offshore to get some of your products or get some of the services or get some of the software written, you really should make that clear up front, because the government may not take too kindly to the fact that you didn't tell them that you had intentions of having your software written offshore, especially if you're selling to DoD or these other agencies here.
Okay.
Eric, Jerry, Lorna, I don't know what you guys think about that, but.
No, I completely agree. And I think it's a great point that there are some laws that don't have to be in your contract to be applicable, like the export control laws. So, you know, it's not that you're kind of off the hook on these things if it's not in your contract. OTA agreement.
Great. We've got about 4 minutes and 4 questions, so we'll try to get our answers in 30 seconds or less. Can someone talk more about the transition process from technology development to propagation under OTAs? Okay. Nobody?
That's hard. I'm not sure I quite understand it, but you know, I think they're you know, that, you know, an OT is to help develop a prototype or develop something that was from a that had technology roots. So it's sort of the next, you know, next phase of development.
Okay, and I'm going to just keep this last slide up that has contact information. Is OT authority regulated differently depending on the industry? For example, are services versus software versus security versus vehicles, are they treated differently?
I think different agencies have different OT grants, and some of those grants can cover products and or services. So you just have to look at the agency that you're interested in dealing with. Like NIH and HHS have very specific grants that are pretty complicated when you look deeply into it. So there are some services that could potentially be covered, but you have to look at the particular statute that gives the grant to that agency.
Okay. Are OTAs only using R&D funding?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. Great.
I have seen them use O&M.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes, yes, and I suppose if you go to OT for production, you'd be using production funds.
Okay.
Fair enough. And then other agencies don't have that mishmash of RDT&E and procurement dollars that DoD has.
Mhm.
Thankfully for that.
You'd still have to follow fiscal law regardless, make sure that the funding matches the purpose.
Great. And is there a requirement for DCAA approved accounting system for T&M type contracts? I'm not sure. Maybe this is for another session. Let's stick with the OTAs unless somebody wants to chime in on that. But let's move through these real quick. Is the OTA contract open to the public domain?
There are, companies, there's no restriction on which companies can participate in OTs depending on whether they're a traditional or non-traditional contractor. Those requirements, at least from DoD, have been loosened a little bit, but companies of all stripes and shapes can participate in the OT process. It may look a little different for a contractor versus a non-contractor, but there's.
But I think, I think that's all right, Eric, but all true. But I think, if I guess to answer the question was like, are they posted all in the same place? And I think the answer to that is no. I mean, if it's a consortium opportunity, it's going to be posted within the consortium. But there are OTs that are posted on, on Beta SAM, if they're, specific like TIAs for Defense Production Act Title III or something like that, so I think it sort of depends.
Great. And is the government required to notify industry of a planned OTA procurement or only if they need to establish competition? How best can contractors look for upcoming OTA opportunities?
There's not really like a posting. There's not like generally a posting of OTA opportunities as there are for traditional procurement opportunities or RFPs that are coming out.
Some organizations do post them on their own websites, and consortiums do too, as Margaret and Jerry and Lorna spoke to earlier. But Margaret's 100% right. There's not a central repository. There should be probably.
Okay, we'll take one last question here. Now that my guard dog is quiet. And I think that might be it. It's actually, are there special OTAs for medical products?
The answer to that is yes. I mean, the only reason I know that is there is I think it's MedTech, MTEC. There's a medical technology consortium that's sponsored by DoD that they played a response in COVID. That's the only reason I know about them. But there are, I'm sure there's a number of medical consortia.
Okay, great. And I think that's all we have time for as far as questions. So if anybody still has questions, or if you typed in a question that we were not able to get to, you've got Margaret, Lorna, Jerry, and Eric's contact information here. They are the true experts here. So feel free to contact them directly. We will get the slides out to everybody in an email, and they'll also be posted, as I mentioned, on slideshare.net. Thanks everybody for joining us. Next month, I believe, is bid protest, and in between now and then, we've got a half a day conference, another hot topics in government contracting, where we're covering PPP, CMMC, and a variety of other hot topics in government contracting. So thanks, Eric, Margaret, Lorna, Jerry, and everyone who joined us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.